Shooting aviation video has come a long way. Today's small sports cameras such as the GoPro are an invaluable tool for safety, training, data recording, and is also one of the best ways to promote aviation. Our future aviators may be the children influenced by watching aviation videos on social media. The challenge with aviation video is that pilots and mechanics are required to follow regulations written before sports cameras even existed. Believe it or not, this is actually a good thing. Just look at the regulations now in place for drones. So the question, can I mount a camera on an aircraft? This is a hot topic. Given the many variables, the answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Here we will briefly cover some regulations, cautions, and solutions. As with anything, the best defense to avoid violation is a good understanding of the requirements and a clear, safe, and documented rationale. We pilots talk about the gray area. The regulations are open to interpretation. The FARs can be viewed differently even within the FAA. Try not to get caught in what is called a division of the regional norm. Groups or regions can easily develop ideas and definitions over time that may differ from the FAA. A great example of this is a FAA memo from 2014. At the time, a company presented this memo online as the FAA says it is okay. Many have assumed this is allowing pilots to stick a GoPro on an aircraft. The intent, if anything, was just the opposite. This memo does well summarize the regulations, and there are some great references we can use from it. It is important, though, to understand this is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you search through the FARs, good luck finding any regs that directly apply to installing cameras. So what guidance do we use? The FAA typically sees attaching anything to an aircraft as an alteration or modification to that aircraft. There are many levels to which an aircraft can be altered. Even though a small GoPro is not much of an alteration, we still need to consider the entire scope of an alteration, as would the FAA. So let's cover the relevant regulations and lay out an easier method to complying with them. This can be confusing even for mechanics. This advisory circular is a tool to assist mechanics. Included is a great flowchart that we can use to navigate the entire scope of an alteration. This flowchart references the applicable FARs in logical order. I know talking about regulations aren't the most exciting, so I will run through this somewhat briefly with a general overview. The first thing we need to establish is that our camera installation is not a major change in type design. An example of this would be an STC. In general, a small camera like a GoPro would rarely be a major change in type design. The definition of a major change is all other changes, if not minor, are major. Okay, so the definition of a minor change is one that has no appreciable effect on the weight, balance, structural strength, reliability, operational characteristics, or other characteristics affecting the airworthiness of the product. The word no means none of these can be affected by your camera. Example, a camera screwed into your wing spar could affect numerous items on this list. You would then require an STC. Weight or balance in this case is not adding the weight of the camera to your weight and balance. It is referring to a change to the weight and balance envelope of the aircraft, such as increasing the gross weight. Just because you fly experimental doesn't mean you're exempt. Part 21 applies to experimental amateur-built aircraft also, meaning if the aircraft is altered in such a way that influences any of these listed items, you may be required to conduct test flights. Here's an example of a major versus minor change. The camera on the left is obviously going to affect items on the list, whereas the GoPro probably not. The large camera depicted would be a major change requiring an STC, whereas the GoPro could be classified as a minor change. The FAA or aircraft manufacturer is responsible for a major change. A minor change, however, can be completed by a mechanic through an alteration. This is where it gets confusing. A change in type design is major or minor, and a minor change is broken into two more categories, major and minor alteration. Changes are under Part 21, and alterations are under Part 43. What does this mean to you? Going back to our flowchart, we follow a minor change, bringing us to page 2. This, by the way, is where experimental aircraft get relief. Part 43 does not apply to home built, so the owner of an experimental amateur-built aircraft can essentially complete an alteration. Just don't forget, Part 21 does apply, as does Part 91, which we will get to shortly. Back to our flowchart, we must figure out if our alteration is major or minor. The chart here guides us through the definition of a major alteration. First, is the alteration listed in the product specs? Product specs would be if your aircraft manufacturer sold a camera mount with specifications for the installation or repair of it. This is not likely. Next, a major alteration is one that might appreciably affect weight, balance, structural strength, performance, power plant operation, flight characteristics, or other qualities affecting airworthiness. Even though this list looks like the major change definition, its meaning is different. If your camera installation might affect any of these on the list, you need to consider a major alteration. You can talk to your mechanic about this. The major alteration process is typically approved by the FAA with a 337 field approval. If needed, you and your mechanic can dig deeper into this using 4313 Appendix A. Lastly, can the alteration be completed according to accepted practices or elementary operations? An example of elementary operations would be the use of a screwdriver. If you need to rivet or weld, this would not be elementary, and you would no longer be a minor alteration. Accepted practices is the allowed maintenance practices your mechanic is responsible for. An important part of this to be aware of is Part 4313B. In short, this is saying that the aircraft in the altered condition needs to work just as well with the camera as without. This gives the FAA one more angle to make sure you are not doing anything that could affect safe flight. The definition of a minor alteration is any alteration that is not major. So, essentially, if no items on this list are affected, and we can maintain accepted practices and elementary operations, we can flow through the chart to a minor alteration. A minor alteration requires only a logbook entry from an A&P mechanic. No 337 or field approval required. Now, just because your buddy with the same make and model aircraft did it, doesn't mean you can. We need to consider every alteration and repair over the life of the aircraft. An example would be a camera installed on the left wing of a Cessna 172. On another 172, the same setup would not be allowed with a G1000, given the camera's close proximity to the magnetometer in the left wing. So at this point, we have covered changes and alterations. An alteration is defined by the FAA as a modification of an aircraft from one sound state to another sound state. What if we do not modify the aircraft at all? If we use a temporary attachment, are we modifying or altering the aircraft? Referring back to the 2014 memo, the FAA states, the use of suction cups or other temporary methods of attachment, not including permanent mechanical attachments to the aircraft, would not be considered a modification to the aircraft. These temporary attachments would not be subject to the regulatory peer review of Part 43. The use of these type attachments, however, are not supported by the FAA and may, in the case of an in-flight detachment, lead to careless operations as in Part 91. In essence, we are operating on the basis that there is nothing saying we can and nothing saying we can't. If the FAA does not support temporary, this means you as the pilot are solely responsible. The word temporary is not even defined in the FARs. So what can we consider temporary? You may have heard using tools is the difference. The use of tools is not actually written anywhere that I know of. However, it may be a good place for us to personally draw the line. It is an easy argument to show that you feel your device is temporary if it can be attached and removed by hand without the use of tools. Once the toolbox comes out, you quickly approach a dark gray area on what a pilot versus a mechanic is allowed to do. There are some advisory circulars for portable electronic devices that touch on temporary. These ACs state, we can use portable electronic devices if they are not a distraction and are not positioned to interfere with aircraft control and operation. Make sure you and your passengers operating a camera are not a distraction or interference to flight. The FAA is not out hunting for cameras. There is a big push to stop cameras falling off aircraft. A violation under Part 91 and the liability of a dropped object is the same whether experimental or certified. There are no exceptions for taking proper safety precautions. The biggest problem is the use of temporary that is too temporary. A suction cup seems like an obvious bad idea. The common use of sticky mounts and plastic parts may not be as obvious. Sticky mounts and plastic parts sold with sports cameras frequently fail, and the FAA has taken great notice at this. The strength of sticky mounts is impressive. The issue is more the paint or gel coat combined with temperature changes, vibration, and contamination. I have seen a small screw through a sticky mount as a safety measure. Even if the sticky mount stays, plastic mounts and plastic cases often break. It is a matter of time before plastic mounts and cases crack from prolonged vibration and UV exposure. Regardless of FAA violation, the price of your camera is nothing compared to a lawsuit. When your face is found on the first video file, it's obvious where the camera came from. The FAA is finding too many bad practices, such as mounting cameras on the top of the wing lifting surface, to control surfaces, and even to the pitot tube. Single fastener mounts should be avoided too. Anything a mechanic or the FAA would approve is required to have redundancy. Hanging a camera and mount from a single screw is asking a lot of that fastener. A standard GoPro at 150 knots has at least 5 pounds of force on it. With 2 or more fasteners, at least if one fails, it could be caught on a pre-flight or inspection. Your mechanic would not use one screw following accepted maintenance practices. Pilots should consider similar redundancy. The most important takeaway is to be safe and use common sense. So let's summarize. What can you do? You can take it upon yourself to use a temporary device. Temporary is not defined nor supported by the FAA. And you, the pilot in command, are taking full responsibility and liability. If temporary is not an option, then maybe a minor alteration is. The minor alteration requires only a logbook entry from an A&P mechanic. Now the responsibility falls on the A&P. So don't be surprised if your mechanic is not willing to hang his or her hat on a non-FAA approved device. The next option is an FAA approval. This is typically accomplished by an IA mechanic using a field approval in 337. Now the responsibility falls on the IA. Once again, don't be surprised if your IA is not accommodating. The IAA and FAA may want engineering data. Data is typically generated by a DER, a designated engineer, which can get expensive. Flight Flix has for sale a number of options under all categories. We have chosen all metal commercial camera mounts available that work great on all types of aircraft. Flight Flix has also streamlined a rating system. Each camera mount has ratings generalizing the FAA requirements. Numerous products even have available a solution for FAA approvals. Rather than navigate the regulations yourself, Flight Flix can help. Again, the most important element is to be safe and use common sense. Have a good understanding of the required regulations. Avoid attaching cameras to or near control surfaces, on top of the wing, and near the pitot system. Take precautions to eliminate camera detachment, avoiding violation and lawsuit. Avoid sticky mounts, plastic parts, and single screw mounts. Resources and answers are available at flightflix.net.